In the lush green hills of Eldermont, a small town nestled between rolling forests and glistening lakes, lived a man whose name had become synonymous with kindness. Charles Everhart. Known far and wide as the generous tycoon, Charles had built an empire in global logistics, transforming a small fleet of delivery trucks into a multinational company with warehouses on every continent. But what set Charles apart wasn't just his wealth, it was how he used it. Charles was born into hardship. His father was a factory worker, and his mother cleaned houses. As a boy, he would walk miles to school, sometimes on an empty stomach. One cold winter, his mother gave him her only coat so he wouldn't freeze on the way to school. That coat, fraying at the edges and patched at the elbows, remained in a glass case in his home as a daily reminder. Never forget where you came from. As his fortunes grew, so did his generosity. Eldermont had once been a struggling town, slowly withering from economic decline. Businesses closed one by one. Families left. Charles, who had long since moved to the city, returned one winter to visit his childhood home. What he found broke his heart: abandoned shops, cracked roads, and despair in the eyes of people he once knew. He could have left and never returned, but instead he stayed. He bought the old textile factory and converted it into a technology hub. He offered jobs and apprenticeships to the townspeople, especially those who had never been given a second chance: ex-convicts, recovering addicts, and the elderly. He built a library filled with computers and rare books, completely free to the public. When the local hospital was on the verge of shutting down, Charles donated enough funds to modernize it entirely, adding a maternity ward, a cancer treatment center, and a helicopter landing pad. Eldermont not only recovered, it flourished. Charles had a unique birthday tradition. Every year on his birthday, rather than throwing lavish parties, he gave away $1 million, but not in a check to a charity. He would find an ordinary person who had done something extraordinary and reward them. One year, it was a janitor who had saved a child from a burning building. Another year, it was a teacher who had tutored hundreds of students for free on weekends. He gave $1 million to a teenage girl who started a food pantry in her neighborhood and used the money to expand it to 10 cities. He never announced these gifts with press releases. The stories often came out quietly, whispered through the grateful voices of those he helped. One day, a young man named Leo, who had grown up in Eldermont's foster system, found an envelope on his doorstep. Inside was a handwritten note: "For your dedication to caring for the children no one else wanted. May this help you care for even more. Z." Along with the note was a check for $500,000. Leo had been working 3 jobs to support a small home for abandoned children. He had no idea anyone knew. Charles never visited, never made a show of it. But he had seen. He always saw. As Charles grew older, his health began to decline. He had no heirs and few close relatives. When asked what he would do with his fortune after his death, Charles would smile and say, "It's already been given." He wasn't exaggerating. He had quietly transferred ownership of many of his assets to trusts, foundations, and community boards. He made sure the decisions would be made locally, not by far-off executives. The only thing he kept for himself was his small house in Eldermont, modest, sunlit, and lined with bookshelves. On the morning of his 84th birthday, Charles passed away peacefully in his sleep. He left no grand monument, no golden statue in his honor. But Eldermont itself stood as a living memorial, a town saved by one man's refusal to turn away, by one man's belief that wealth was not meant to be hoarded, but shared. The people of Eldermont held a vigil that night. Children lit candles. Elders shared stories. And as the town gathered under a starlit sky, someone read a line Charles once wrote in a letter: "True wealth is not measured by what you keep, but by what you give away, and the joy you leave behind in others." And so, the legend of Charles Everhart, the generous tycoon, lived on, not in gold or stock portfolios, but in hearts, homes, and the hope he left behind. After the passing of Charles Everhart, Eldermont mourned not just the loss of a benefactor, but of a man who had, quite literally, rebuilt their lives. But in the quiet months that followed, something unexpected began to stir, not in the form of money but in people. When the town lawyer, Marjorie Elkins, opened Charles's will, everyone expected a list of charities or perhaps a final grand donation. But what she read surprised even her. There was no fortune to divide, no sprawling estates, no vault of treasures. Instead there was a letter. To those I leave behind. I have given you everything already, not in coin but in courage, not in stocks but in stories. If you must inherit something from me, let it be the responsibility to give. Give time, attention, chances, and grace. This is the wealth that lasts. Charles E. The will included one directive: the formation of a council called the Circle of Givers, 12 people chosen not by wealth or profession, but by their acts of kindness. And so, the town set out to fulfill Charles's final request. The first members were not celebrities or scholars. They were ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Maya Valdez, a single mother who turned her front yard into a free daycare so neighborhood parents could work. Elliot Crane, a war veteran who spent his mornings repairing bikes for kids too poor to afford new ones. Sister Alma, a retired nun who walked door to door checking on elderly neighbors during winter storms. Each year, new members would be inducted into the circle. Their only job was to identify need, compassion, and potential, and to give. Not necessarily money but mentorship, tools, shelter, and most importantly, hope. The council soon became the moral compass of Eldamont. Eldamont, once a forgotten dot on the map, began drawing attention. Reporters came to cover the unusual transformation. A town with no mayor, but a council of givers. A school system funded partly by ex-students. A grocery store that had no set prices. You paid what you could or volunteered your time in exchange. One day, a stranger arrived. A man in his 30s named Miles Everhart, Charles's estranged nephew. Rumors had always swirled about Charles having family who had chosen a different path. Miles had lived abroad, in luxury, distanced from the man he'd once considered cold and impossible to impress. He came expecting to claim what he thought was rightfully his. But there was nothing to inherit, at least not in the traditional sense. Instead, he was handed a small package. Inside was a letter and the frayed coat Charles had worn as a boy. Miles, I had hoped you would find your way here. This coat is all I had as a child. Now it is all that is left of me in the material sense. What you do with it will determine if you've inherited anything at all. Start small. Do something selfless. Let the coat remind you to walk the hard road, the road that gives more than it takes. Love. Charles. Miles was furious at first, but something about that letter haunted him. He stayed in Eldamont, at first out of stubborn pride, then curiosity. Eventually, he began volunteering at the town's literacy center. One night, a young boy named Jalen, who couldn't read a single word, sounded out a full sentence for the first time, and beamed. Miles felt something shift inside him. That night, he took the old coat, mended it, and wore it. From then on, people began calling him Little Charles, not because of any bloodline, but because of the legacy he had chosen to carry forward. In time, the Circle of Givers inspired other towns to form their own. The story of Charles Everhart became required reading in schools. Documentaries were made. But Eldamont never allowed itself to become a museum piece. It remained a living place, where kindness was currency, and generosity was taught like any other skill. The town's motto was carved into stone at the entrance, beneath the statue of a tree growing from a single seed. Wealth is not what you take, it's what you leave behind. And though Charles was gone, his spirit had multiplied, passed on not through DNA, but through deliberate kindness. Because one generous man had dared to believe that his greatest investment wasn't in markets, but in people. True generosity is not measured by the size of a gift, but by the spirit in which it is given. Wealth can build buildings, but kindness builds legacies. In a world chasing success, be the one who plants seeds, for the trees that will shade others.